Hello, everyone. I'm Carolyn Waters, head librarian here at the New York Society Library. I want to welcome you all to tonight's program with Farah Jasmine Griffin, author of the new book, Read Until You Understand: The Profound Wisdom of Black Life and Literature. Tonight's program is very special to us for a number of reasons. First, we're in the members' room. It feels so good to be here. This is the first in-person event we have held in over 18 months. It feels great to be here with a live audience. Another exciting development, though, is that we are live streaming tonight's event to hundreds of people online, thanks to Alex Sanger, who generously supported the purchase of technology that made that possible. So this is very exciting. We haven't done this before. And moreover, not only has Dr. Griffin written this fantastic new book, but she was the guest curator of our new exhibition, Black Literature Matters, right outside the door here in our Peluso Family Exhibition Gallery. And because we were unable to do so when the exhibition opened, we will be celebrating the work that she and Harriet Shapiro, our head of exhibitions, did on this wonderful exhibition immediately following the presentation. Now, before I introduce our speaker, just a few announcements. First, may I ask those of you in the room to make sure that you silence your cell phones, and please wear your mask during the presentation part of the evening. In case this is the first time you are learning about the New York Society Library, we are the oldest library and cultural institution in New York City. We were founded in 1754. We have approximately 300,000 books in our open stacks available for browsing and checkout, beautiful and quiet reading and study spaces in the building, and all kinds of events like the author lecture you're about to hear tonight. We also present children's programs for babies through teens, writing workshops, reading seminars, and in a post-pandemic world, we even host tea time and happy hours here in the building. We are a most welcoming place and open to all, so we would love to have you join us. Feel free to stop by anytime to get a tour and obviously, absolutely to see our new exhibition. Now, Read Until You Understand: The Profound Wisdom of Black Life and Literature is the work of a brilliant scholar who, in the Washington Post reviewer's words, is an encouraging literature professor, a reflective memoirist, and a cultural and political observer, all in the same book. Farah Jasmine Griffin has taken to heart the phrase, "Read until you understand," a line her father, who died when she was 9, wrote in a note to her. She has made it central to this book about love of the majestic power of words and love of the magnificence of Black life, weaving together art, history, and memoir. Through this book, she challenges us to reckon with our commitment to all the nation's inhabitants and our responsibilities to all humanity. Publishers Weekly writes that Read Until You Understand is perfect for literature lovers. This survey and its moving insights will stick with readers well after the last page is turned. Of Dr. Griffin, Cornell West says, her magical words enchant and empower us, like those of her towering heroes, Toni Morrison, Billie Holiday, James Baldwin, and Wilhelmina Griffin. Farah Jasmine Griffin is the inaugural chair of the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department at Columbia University, the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature. She has published widely on issues of race and gender, feminism, jazz, and cultural politics. And she's the author of 8, 9, I counted, I'm not quite sure, including Who Set You Flowin', The African American Migration Narrative, If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, In Search of Billie Holiday, and Harlem Nocturne, Women Artists and Progressive Politics During World War I, among others. Dr. Griffin is also a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow. Please welcome Farah Jasmine Griffin.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you all for being here this evening. I just cannot tell you how thrilled I am to be in a room with other people, and for that room to be this beautiful, beautiful space in this very special library. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm also happy to be there with you, people who are joining us online as well. I want to thank all of my friends and colleagues here at the library, most especially Carolyn and Sarah and Harriet, with whom I met weekly on Zoom and occasionally in person as we were doing this exhibition for over a year. Maria Luisa back there, just the hardest working young woman I know, and fellow book lover and Instagram person who I communicate with all the time, and Adrienne Ingram, who is the reason why I'm here. She recommended me, and I like to joke and say she recommended me. We actually met at another amazing institution in the city. Adrienne and I met at the Schomburg, and the director of the Schomburg is here tonight, right, Joy Vivian? So thank you. So we met there, but we know each other through my husband. Adrienne was his editor for a while, and when she reached out to him about approaching me to work with Harriet on this exhibition, he immediately agreed because he thought, oh, I'll get a membership to the library. So unfortunately, he can't be here. He has his own Zoom event this evening. But I've been looking forward to this evening since we scheduled it, and it gives me the opportunity to talk about two things to which I've devoted much of my time over the last year or more. My recent book, Read Until You Understand, The Profound Wisdom of Black Life in Literature, and our current exhibition, Black Literature Matters, for which I served as guest curator. I began writing the book that would become Read Until You Understand, and it helped, began to be shaped into that book, also with the help of my wonderful editor, Amy Cherry, who's here tonight from Norton. I began writing it around or during the 2016 presidential campaign, and shortly after when Amy and I met to sit down and talk about it. But I'd been thinking about writing it for many years, and so what I say is I've been writing toward it for decades. For decades, I've been writing toward this book, but the election actually helped to, the whole campaign season and the election helped to crystallize my ideas about why African American literary history was so important, I thought, to helping us understand the history of the nation, as well as its struggle towards democracy. And I finished the book during the spring and summer of 2020, which was the period of the global pandemic, as well as the global protests that followed the murder of George Floyd. And it was at this time that Adrienne also reached out to me with Harriet Shapiro's wonderful idea for the exhibition, already titled Black Literature Matters. So here was an opportunity to explore the library's collection and bring some of the books to which I devoted a lifetime of study to a broader audience, outside of those who read my scholarship or enroll in my classes. And furthermore, while the book focuses on writers from the United States, the exhibition would allow me to include writers from other parts of the African diaspora, especially the Caribbean and the continent of Africa. So tonight, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the book. I'll share some portions of it with you that I think resonate with the exhibition, and then I hope to leave enough time for a discussion about both the book and the exhibition. I had three goals in writing Read Until You Understand. One, most importantly, I wanted to share my passion for a body of literature written by African American writers and to offer one way of reading them that might illuminate our understanding of some of the most pressing issues of our time. And as I say in the book, I wanted to draw upon a lifetime of reading and almost 30 years of teaching African American literature to explore how, in addition to addressing the concerns about democracy, and actually perhaps even more than these issues, the works also speak to ideas and values that have concerned humanity since the beginning of time. I wanted to share a series of valuable lessons learned from those who have sought to better a nation that depends upon them and yet too often has despised them. But in the process, they change the world. 2, I wanted to honor the many teachers in my life, in person and on the page, especially my very first teacher, my father, who is a dominant character in the book, who died when I was 9 years old, and also the writings of the great Toni Morrison. Both my father and Ms. Morrison's writings shaped my life and my learning in ways that I am forever grateful. And 3, I wanted to give a gift to book lovers and to readers with this book about books that I hope in the writing is a work of literature in and of itself. It certainly aspires to be. So a little bit about those things that came together in this book. My father was my first teacher in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is also a character in this book. But my father was my first teacher in Philadelphia, a Philadelphia that was still recognizable from W.E.B. Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro, even though for us it was the late 60s and early 70s. And I talk about in the book about how he would take me on long walks to Independence Hall, past Mother Bethel AME Church and other historic sites, and in so doing introduce me to the history of the founding of our nation and our city's role in it. He told me the stories of the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, but also the founders of the Free African Society, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. His lessons range widely into the ideas of Black American thinkers, from Frederick Douglass to Angela Davis. A voracious lover of books and jazz music, my father was rarely without a paperback book in his back pocket or an album on the stereo. His Philadelphia was urbane and music-filled, reaching back to the era of bebop with Dizzy Gillespie, including John Coltrane and Billie Holiday, on through rhythm and blues and the newly emerging sound of Philadelphia. His book collection included works of history, fiction, biography, and current events. And when he died, when I was 9 years old, I inherited all of his books and albums, as well as the love of language, the love of learning, filtered through so much that he had bequeathed to me. Under the careful guidance of my mother, I lost myself in the pages and sounds he left behind. This was my inheritance, my legacy. Little did I know at the time that it would also become my life's work. This moment of loss, seeking and remembering, constitute the genesis of my own intellectual pursuits and the starting point for my book, which brings together a lifetime of reading and close to 3 decades of teaching African American literature, theory, culture, and history, but also reflects on the shaping influences of my father and my Philadelphia upbringing during the last decades of the 20th century. Through a combination of memoir, historical examination, and literary analysis, I've tried to demonstrate the riches of a community that demonstrated an ethics of care to me and my mother following my father's death, even when that community itself was often under siege. I hope I have honored so-called ordinary working class people who forged an extraordinary heritage and passed on ways of knowing. Finally, through a series of questions and some suggested answers emerge. What might an engagement with an urban cultural legacy alongside Black literature, and to a lesser degree music and the visual arts, teach us about our nation and our quest for democracy and belonging? And also, beyond the slippery concepts of race and nation, what might engaging these ideas teach us about our fullest blossoming of humanity? I believe that all Americans, indeed all freedom-loving people everywhere, should have exposure to and an understanding of what Black writing, as well as the related arts, offers and what it pretends for a way forward. The book is organized around 10 concepts, themes, and ideals: legacy, mercy, Black freedom and the idea of America, justice, rage and resistance, death, love, joy, beauty, and grace. Each chapter provides an autobiographical meditation and cultural commentary that may be informed by some mixture of history, philosophy, theology, or politics. My turn to autobiography is both to tell a singular story and to note the ways in which that story is but a thread in a larger fabric of Black American life in the United States, one that connects generations like my father's and mine. In this way, my book both examines and contributes to a tradition of writing that has always placed great value on the critical insights of autobiography and on the ways of communicating history and culture. The richness of the works I write about, blended with stories from my own family and the urban community that I grew up in, resonate with and amplify the notion of literature as equipment for living, and demonstrates the ways, in a larger way, that the humanities still help to give us materials to live with, to accompany us on our journey with others on this planet. I try to reveal how a people have lived for generations with style, grace, brilliance, and beauty in the face of persistent crisis and catastrophe. So let me turn to the book now. I want to share with you a selection from the third chapter, Black Freedom and the Idea or Ideal. It's the title, when you read it, it's the idea with the L in parentheses, of America. Now, this chapter was not part of the original outline for the book that I gave to Amy, so it was one of those surprises that kept happening. But she was a wonderful editor, and she gave me room to pursue things. It was not part of the original outline for the book, or at least not in the form that it appears. The ideas were seeping throughout, but there was to have been a chapter on freedom, but it evolved into a consideration of the relationship between Black freedom and the idea of America. And while much of the book centers around my upbringing in Philadelphia and that city's history is a common thread throughout the whole book, this chapter was actually a product of my having relocated there for the month of July in the summer of 2019. In fact, much of it actually came to me, or the way I like to think of it is, the book told me that it wanted to be written in this way. It was a very bossy book. But it happened around the city's celebration of Independence Day 2019. So I was in Philadelphia. It's one of those cities that takes July 4th very, very seriously. And that's when, I'd leave my mother's and go around the corner to a cafe where I'd been writing. And that's when the book just told me, kind of, this is what I want you to write about. So I'll read some selections for you, and I'll just talk my way through some of it, just so you get an idea of the arc of the chapter. And as with most of the chapters, it opens up with an autobiographical sort of story, and then we move into a discussion of some of the writers. So here we go. At some point, in first or second grade, administrators from my neighborhood school reached out to my parents, expressing concern that I'd refused to stand for the Star-Spangled Banner, long before Colin Kaepernick. This was during school assembly. I attended the neighborhood elementary school, McDaniel, less than a block away from my home. It was predominantly Black, and it sat diagonally across the street from St. Edmund's, a Catholic school, which was predominantly Irish and Italian. I didn't sing the national anthem or say the Pledge of Allegiance because, according to my father, our country refused to recognize us as full citizens or even as human beings. And when my father died, my family decided not to request a flag for his coffin. He'd served in the segregated Navy just after World War II and was honorably discharged, but he never spoke to me about his service. It appears to have been a traumatic experience for him. My mother, ever the diplomat, instructed me to stand for the anthem and for the Pledge of Allegiance, though I didn't have to sing the former or recite the latter. She said, just do like the little Jehovah's Witness boy does. The Jehovah's Witness she referred to was one of 2 or 3 remaining white students in the entire school. At one point, I resumed reciting the Pledge of Allegiance because I like reciting things from memory, and I especially like the sound of that declarative ending with liberty and justice for all. The Star-Spangled Banner never held that kind of appeal for me since it's so militaristic and bombastic. So even today, I stand for it, but I don't sing it. It's my least favorite of the patriotic American songs. Another, My Country 'Tis of Thee, has been forever ruined for me by my father's rewriting of the lyrics. My country 'tis of thee, land of no liberty. In contrast, I've grown to love Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land because of its expansive, inclusive sense of the nation. However, America the Beautiful is the one that I find most appealing, perhaps because of Ray Charles's soulful rendering of it, or because it portrays the country's wondrous natural beauty. I especially came to appreciate the magnificent landscape after a cross-country drive when I was a young adult. It is the one thing I love unconditionally about this land. I love without ambivalence. That's its beauty. During my brief time with my father, I learned of his disdain for what he saw as the country's hypocrisy. He taught me that the Vietnam War was a travesty and shared his belief that Black people shouldn't fight for the country, especially not against other poor people of color. I can still recall reciting my opinions on the war to his buddies when I accompanied him to the barbershop, and they showered me with praise. Oh, that little sister sure can rap, and then they gave me quarters. From my current vantage point, I would describe my father as a Black nationalist. His nationalism was informed by his youth as a bebopper and a very, very brief stint in the Nation of Islam. And as I said, he loved Malcolm X. He prided himself on having met him during his frequent visits to Philadelphia. My father may have had communist sympathies, but he found the Communist Party's pursuit of racial integration of the working classes naive. He lamented being too old to join the Panthers, though his admiration for them was immeasurable. Nonetheless, Emerson Griffin possessed a deep admiration of the founding documents, and though critical, he held a kind of disdainful awe for U.S. military might. What I have learned of my father in the years following his death tells me that at some point he was a bit more hopeful about the country's possibility for racial reconciliation. In his 1958 Temple University yearbook, he lists his membership in the NAACP. So at some point he believed in the reformist politics of that august organization. In fact, my three earliest memories of my father are: one, the sound of his melodic whistle as he turned the corner on his way home from work; two, watching from our living room window as he built me a snowman; and three, his returning home following a march he'd participated in. The latter memory stood out because it was one of the rare times I saw him in a suit and tie, and because of the round yellow button he wore on his lapel, which said "Back to the Wall." Had he been protesting the racial exclusion of Girard College, a boarding school for fatherless boys founded by Stephen Girard, who was a 19th century banker and philanthropist? There are many things named for Girard in the city of my birth, including Girard Estates in South Philadelphia within walking distance of our row house. A small, exclusive enclave of well-kept homes, the estate seemed to have operated under a restrictive covenant. In my childhood, no Black people lived there. Upon his death, Girard's will established a boarding school for, quote, poor male white orphans, end quote, which opened in 1848 in North Philadelphia. Girard College sat behind a 10-foot walls in the midst of what became a Black working class neighborhood in the mid-20th century. And so in the mid-60s, there were protests to integrate that school, and the NAACP led those protests. So by word and example, my father taught me that protest and resistance were both personal and collective. We march, we stand up or sit down for what we believe, but most importantly, we read. He insisted that reading and study were central to our struggle as a people and to my overall development as a human being. And one morning, I remember him giving me a book. I was in third grade. He gave me two paperback books. One was called Black Struggle, A History of the Negro in America. And on the front page, he wrote, "Read this book. Baby, read this book. You may not understand it at first, but read it and understand. Baby, read it until you understand. He wrote it in pencil. The second book was a little book called The Little Red, White, and Blue Book, Revolutionary Quotations by Great Americans. And he'd written notes throughout that book. And one page he has something that says, "Start here, there's lots of Frederick Douglass." So within months of, I remember this was third grade, when my father died when I was in third grade. So he died shortly after giving me these books. So they became especially important to me. And I carried them with me throughout college and graduate school. The books held a version of history that I did not learn in school. There was no Star-Spangled Banner version. The Little Red, White, and Blue book offered more of a "this land is your land" perspective, and Black struggle was closer to the lyrics of Gil Scott-Heron's Winter in America. If you recall that song, "From the Indians who welcomed the Pilgrims, and to the buffalo who once ruled the plains, like the vultures circling beneath the clouds, looking for the rain, looking for the rain. The Constitution, a noble piece of paper, would free society. It struggled, but then died in vain. And now democracy is ragtime on the corner, hoping for some rain, looking like it's hoping for some rain. And now it's winter, winter in America." So that was the version of the Little Red, White, and Blue book, which had quotations from everyone from Thomas Paine to Malcolm X and others, and Martin Luther King. Frederick Douglass appears in both books. My father owned copies of the 1845 narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, as well as the 1855 My Bondage and My Freedom. He revered both Malcolm and Douglass as much for their autodidactism, which he shared, as for their eloquence and courage, to which he aspired. I now understand that the two of them, Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X, had very different conceptions of the nation that gave birth to them. For Douglass, the United States was a work in progress, capable of being perfected. For Malcolm, it was irredeemable. Perhaps my father started out like Douglass and ended up like Malcolm. In the rest of the chapter, I do a close reading and analysis. Hopefully it doesn't feel like an analysis. It feels more like I'm telling you a story of Douglass's most famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," where he finally settles on his belief in the Constitution, that the Constitution is a liberty document, he calls it. And then I cite a little known Douglass speech that he wrote toward the end of his life called "The Ballad and the Bullet." It's a Douglass speech, and he says this is after the failure of Reconstruction and the beginning of disenfranchisement of African Americans. And he says, we need the ballot and we also need the bullet. Now, of course, famously, that's Malcolm X's speech, right? Douglass says the ballot and the bullet. Malcolm says the ballot or the bullet. And so I move on to talk about Malcolm's speech, the ballot or the bullet. And it's notable because it's the first time that Malcolm says that African Americans should vote. Because prior to that time, he said it's a sham, don't waste your time, don't vote. The other thing that those two speeches have in common with these kind of brilliant, charismatic speakers and intellectuals is that both speeches mark a break with their mentors. So for Douglass, it's a break with Garrison, who had been his mentor and helped enable his ascendancy. And so he breaks with Garrison in that speech. And for Malcolm, it's a break with Elijah Muhammad, right? Who really also says no civic engagement at all. And Malcolm has broken with him a few months beforehand, and it's one of his first speeches after. He actually gives it twice. There are two versions, slightly different versions. So I go on to talk about those two, and the chapter ends with a discussion of Barack Obama. And I look at both Obama's autobiography as well as his famous race speech, which took place where? Of course, in Philadelphia, at Independence Mall. And the autobiography is especially insightful and helpful, one, because it is a work of literature. He is a writer, beautiful writer, and he is very self-conscious and aware of writing himself into a number of traditions, one of them being the African American literary tradition. And so I talk about that and how Douglass and Malcolm, and to some degree Morrison as well, helped to shape him, shape his identity, his intellectual sense of himself. And then um, turn to look at the 4th of July, look at the speech that he gives in Philadelphia, which is a break with another mentor. If you remember, it's his break with Jeremiah Wright. Right. And he is called upon to do that. And he tries not to do it. And then eventually he does. And so I then go and look at the speech as well as the autobiography. And I close the chapter in this way. It says, I don't imagine either Douglass, with his hope in America having been consistently challenged, or Malcolm, who never acquired the hope in the nation's possibilities, could have imagined the rise of Barack Obama. For that matter, neither would my father have imagined the possibility of Barack Obama's political career. I know that he would have been ambivalent about anyone who wanted to be the president of the United States, though I expect he would have been as proud of Obama, the candidate, as my mother was, if less enamored than she. She was so enamored of Barack Obama. And after looking closely at those speeches, I close with this quotation from Obama toward the end of Dreams from My Father. He writes, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident. In those words, I hear the spirit of Douglass and Delaney, Jefferson and Lincoln, the struggles of Martin and Malcolm and unheralded marchers. I hear all of these voices asking the very same questions that have come to shape my life. What is our community, and how might that community be reconciled with our freedom? How far do our obligations reach? How do we transform mere power into justice, mere sentiment into love? And that's in Dreams of My Father. Just beautiful writing. These are the words, the questions that drove the young man who momentarily transformed us into a nation of believers, a nation that was willing to give hope a chance. It paints a vision of a nation we aspire to be. It raises the timeless questions, questions that enable us to ennoble us and lift us even in the asking of them. And yet, the reaction to this vision was so angered and so frightened a large swath of America. The backlash against it and Obama so harsh and so swift that it stunned even those of us who never shared his optimism. Yet we hold out. We did hold out hope that the change he described might one day be possible. Many of us understood the words of Toni Morrison, who in an interview with The Guardian recalled, quote, feeling truly American for the first time, she says, when she attended Obama's 2008 inauguration. She said, quote, I felt very powerfully patriotic. I felt like a kid. The Marines and the flag, which I never look at, all of a sudden it looked nice, worthy. It only lasted a couple of hours, but I was amazed. That music that I really don't like, God Bless America, is a dumb song. I mean, it's not beautiful, but I really felt that for that little moment. It's Morrison. Black Americans' understanding of America is too realistic, too cautious, too conscious of the lessons of history to possess an unbridled patriotism. We know that at best our country is a work in progress and that the battle to perfect it is an uphill climb. And nowhere was this more evident in the electorate's response to the 2 terms of an Obama's presidency. The racial resentments of large numbers of voters had been simmering since his first presidential campaign, and one could witness elements of it in the crowds that flocked to see and hear Sarah Palin and the running mate of Republican nominee John McCain. So we know how that all turned out. And also under Obama, the nation witnessed a number of high-profile vigilante and police murders of Black people, which gave birth to the Black Lives Matter movement as well at the same time. So one of the things that I conclude with this chapter is that the struggle over the idea of America, over the ideal of America, is ongoing, and that's the case in the history that I share. Um, and it was especially the case as I was finishing this book. Amy will remember I went back to revise chapters um, as we were waiting for the 2020 election to be resolved. And so it was just ongoing. It felt that way. Um, the book primarily focuses on literature. Many of the books that you will see in the exhibition are part of that, but it also spends some time on music and a little bit of time on the visual arts. And for those people who purchase this first printing, you will get a full color reproduction of the Bearden painting that I talk about, and also of the cover of a painting that was on the cover of the edition of Sula that I first read when I was 13. And you're lucky because it's never going to be in color again, right, Amy? So I'll stop there and open up for questions or comments, either about the book or anything I said, or also about the exhibition as well. I think we have plenty of time, right? Yeah. Or comments. They don't have to be questions, whatever. Yes. Yeah. Right. So I go into this in the book. My father was a welder at the Sunship Building Company. He received a associate's degree in architectural engineering under the GI Bill, and had aspirations of becoming an architect, but never became an architect. So he was a working class man, a kind of working class intellectual. And it's interesting, I was thinking the other day, in terms of all the books that we had in the house, almost none of them were hardback books. People were asking me about his collection. They were all paperback books, because he would put them in the back of his pocket on his way to work. The hardback book that I remember was you'll like this, Berenice, my student Berenice, was a book about French grammar. She speaks French beautifully, so yes. But that was the hardback book. He never really talked about when he first started reading, but it wasn't something that was fostered by his parents. He was kind of the only son prince for his mother, so I'm sure she encouraged it. My grandfather, Alonzo Griffin, was actually his stepfather, but he did not know that, and had a fairly difficult relationship with him. And so this is my father's humor. He did not find out until he was an adult that Alonzo Griffin was not his father. And when he found that out, he said, "That makes sense because I knew he was too stupid." So, he was very confident in his own intellectual abilities, to say the least, right? I write about my mother. The book starts with my father and ends on my mother. And my mother is a crucial and important influence. But I wanted to also honor this struggling, who had his challenges, working class Black father who, in 9 years, devoted so much time to his daughter. And that was something that even in the literature that I read that I didn't see. And so I thought, if I can contribute that to the literature, that would be very exciting for me. And in terms of the analysis of, everyday people, there were a few people, I call them the street corner intellectuals, who would analyze books and talk about books. But there's a chapter here fully devoted to Black music. And I say that even more than books, it was music that permeated our lives and that sent us off on these really kind of theological and political conversations that, one often associates with books, but that's the role that music played. And so the chapter on music is about my family had a little restaurant. And it's just like, we used to call it the restaurant, but it wasn't. It was like a little luncheonette. It had a counter and some Formica counter and some little stools or something. But there was a jukebox. And so I write about the jukebox and about how, mostly it's like that's music to dance to or love songs or, but there was also this music. There was a series of albums by Stevie Wonder, a series of albums by Marvin Gaye. Well, actually, Marvin Gaye's What's Going On album. And those sparked a kind of deep intellectual debate and conversation about the war, about ecology, about spirituality and God, about death, that really shaped a kind of sensibility, right? So that same kind of analysis that you're talking about happened at the level of talking about the music, right? and the artists who were seen as the kind of belonging to the community, but the community also belonging to them. So, I had a remarkable education, and so one, start with my father, who taught me to read and write before I went to school, and then I went to the neighborhood public school, McDaniel, which I mentioned, with very devoted teachers who were faced with overwhelming challenges of a community that was undergoing change at the time. And then my father died in March of 1972 when I was in third grade. And by that spring, I was selected to go to a magnet school in another part of Philadelphia called the Julia Reynolds Masterman Laboratory and Demonstration School. And children from all over the city went to that school. I took 2 buses every morning to go. I started in 4th grade, and it is still considered the best public school in Philadelphia. At the time, it was a feeder school for 2 high schools, Central, which was the boys' school, and Girls High, which was the girls' school, that were the good, really good public schools. But I went to Masterman through 9th grade. I talk about my teachers at Masterman, an interracial group of teachers who were deeply devoted to their students. And it was McDaniel was Black except for the little Jehovah's Witness boy. And Masterman was interracial and interclass. Like, if for the people who didn't want to send their kids wanted their kids to have a public school education and didn't want to send them to the private schools, some of them went there to Masterman. And then in the summer, so Masterman went from 4th to 9th grade, you graduated, and they were just beginning to start their high school. It was an experiment, and I was going to stay for the experiment, but I got a scholarship through a program called A Better Chance. And at first they looked at me for boarding schools, and my mother was like, no way. So I went to a elite all-girls school in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. So the book's geography goes from South Philadelphia to this part of Philadelphia where Masterman was, to the main line. And then at the school in Bryn Mawr, which is called the Baldwin School for Girls, I got a very strong literary education, and I learned how to technically write. I mean, I've always been obsessed with writing, obsessive about writing, but I learned how to write at the Baldwin School for Girls. So one of the things that runs throughout this book is that, unlike many people in my community that I grew up with, I was not raised in the church. My father was an agnostic. One of the first songs he taught me was Gershwin's It Ain't Necessarily So. My mother was not a church member, but she was a praying woman and taught me how to pray. I had one grandmother who was a Baptist churchgoer. She died when I was young. And the rest of my family my immediate family really were not very religious people. But, growing up in a working class Black neighborhood in the 70s, to say that you're not religious or you don't go to church, that's one thing. I didn't have that kind of religious education, but Christianity permeated everything. And even there were a lot of people who were claiming to be Muslims, but their style was still very Baptist-like. was very, so it was everywhere. And then I had friends who were, I went to church with friends. Our community was Christians and Muslims and a lot of doubters and free thinkers too. And I had friends who went to church, and some of them were very fundamentalist. And I say in the book that I never worried about my father, whether he was in heaven or whether he was in hell, because I didn't know about those as options until my saved friends told me that they were. But I had, even on that, there was a continuum. There were people who were very fundamentalist and other people who were less so and very welcoming. So that's one thing. The ideas about mercy and grace, there are two chapters, but there's also a chapter about love and death and joy and all of those things. But the mercy chapter and the grace chapter are informed by my readings of theologians, by my readings in theology, by my conversations with theologians. The late James Cone, I would have long conversations with him about mercy. My friend, graduate school classmate, and now president of Union Theological Seminary, Serene Jones, I have long conversations with her about grace. My husband is a biblical scholar. And so he also helped inform, my thoughts about religion. So I think that those ideas run throughout the book, and a sense of spirituality definitely runs throughout the book. Yeah, I think that also, it's sort of a, not a warning, but just a reminder that whenever we're doing any kind of systems of classification, to simply constantly ask ourselves, what are the consequences of this classification? What are we saying about doing this? Who gets left in? Who gets left out? What larger statements are we making? And I think that, for her, it was just like, why are all those books dismissed over in this side? That doesn't make any sense. So she just changed them, which I love too. Yeah, exactly. I'm just going to change this, right? So the question is, how does Toni Morrison's life and work resonate with me? So Toni Morrison's work is one of the, it's just, I talk about her in every chapter, basically. I talk about her work in every chapter. I knew Ms. Morrison. She was a friend. I loved her dearly. I don't talk about her life or my relationship with her in the book. I'm very conscious of not wanting to write a Toni and me book. There will be some of those, and they'll be good, and we'll read them, and we'll learn a lot from them, but I did not want to write one. But I did feel like, I'm just going to see if I can find what I say about her. Here it is. I'll just read it. I say, in the questions that I raise throughout these pages, I have been deeply influenced by a lifelong intellectual, aesthetic, political, and spiritual engagement with the writings of the late Toni Morrison. And informed by her writings, I ask a series of questions of selected works by Black writers. Most importantly, in the midst of a hostile society, a society that wants our labor or our death, we live in pursuit of justice, in pursuit of freedom, and longing for a bit of grace. How shall we live? How shall we treat each other? And how shall we treat our compatriots, some of whom are guilty of crimes against us? So those are questions that for me arose from a reading of Morrison. And I started reading her when I was 13 years old, and it was life-changing, even though I didn't understand much of it. And I, read her and reread her constantly. So her work is the other presence. My father and Morrison's work. My father never read Toni Morrison. But those are the constant sort of presences throughout the book, and the book is dedicated to her. So I hope that answers that question. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, don't we all wish we had Farah as our teacher in college now? I know I do. Berenice, you're very lucky. Thank you, Farah, so much for being here. And thank you all for attending our event tonight. I want to say, just in closing, how profoundly enriched we have been here at the library to have you collaborating with us. And you have truly opened our eyes to the riches that are right here in our collection. So thank you all, and good night to those of you watching us virtually.